Think we're live. Hello and welcome to Synergetics stream number 9.0. It is July 4th, 2021, and today we'll be talking about Synergetics. So let me just load up the YouTube live chat. Feel free, if you're watching live, to write a comment there. Okay, today we'll be talking about Synergetics. You can write in the YouTube live chat if you want. Today in Synergetic stream number 9.0, the spirit for today is honor, freedom, and information. We're going to go over the key memes and themes and things to integrate as usual, and then go through some text readings. Today, rather than Synergetics actually directly, we're going to be going into Grunch of Giants and World Game, and then also a Playboy interview. And it's going to be also about a little bit of history and random thoughts on America because it's the 4th of July. So what is Synergetics? Synergetics is relational and multi-scale thinking. It's connected to accessible experiences and to the wait, let me just check why my network was dropping. It's connected to accessible experiences, tangible things that we can hold, but also, I'll turn down the stream. Sorry about that. As well as things that we can think through ourselves. So there's no appeal to authority. It's more like systems thinking, and that entails itself to engineering and a few other areas that we go into. In Synergetics, there isn't an infinitesimal or an infinite, so there's nothing that's infinitely big, nor is there anything that's infinitely small. And points and lines and planes are basically just thought of differently in terms of Synergetics, because space filling, volume enclosing is when things start to actually exist. In Synergetics, design and design science is framed as anticipatory and cybernetic, and there's this relationship between tensegrity and synergetics, kind of like engineering and physics. So synergetics is the geometry of thinking, and then tensegrity is more about building physical structures that embody some of those principles. And we find out from both branches, from theoretical or applied, that space has a certain shape. So whether in physics discovering that there's certain geometry of space, or the synergetic way of thinking about it, space has a shape, and so designing within that is the imperative. Universe is the total scenario, and that means all that there is, so you don't need to put a the before universe, but actually we'll return to that later. And then system is any defined subsystem, which entails a shape that's volume enclosing. So every system entails the boundary states, the blanket states, and then also what's enclosed, and then what's excluded. Then this idea of 4D comes up a lot, like four-dimensional. There's 4D time lock, which is this shape on the right side. Then there's the emphasis on the tetrahedron, and on that being the basis of all measurement and volume, the 1 down here, 1 volume, rather than the cube or the square, which is here with a 3 volume. So in other words, you can sort of repack tet volumes into the cube, but you get all these irrational things arising if this is your default descriptor, which is why in Synergetics, the tetrahedron with the edge of 1 and a volume scaled to 1 is what the unit is. And there's other senses of 4D, like from Kirby's slide here, with the polytopes and the geometry, so higher dimensional geometry. Then space and time, 3 plus 1 or 4, and then tetrahedron is minimal shape. Nothing's really changed on the things to integrate side, except that the Playboy interview was previously on here, and now that's going to be in this discussion. And then just one before the Grunch, one shout out slash cool thing to look into if people are interested is the work of Casey House and the Developing Sin U. This was a couple weeks ago now, that the Trim Tab Book Club, Casey joined, and we were able to see a presentation, some of the cool stuff that is happening here. So check out this casey-house.com for cool visualizations like these ones. Cool stuff. All right. On to the Grunch of Giants. So this is not Synergetics, but going the requisite few steps of explanation away from any source text from Grunch of Giants. There were so many ways to bring it back to Synergetics in the distance, but proximally, I thought, and given the nature of the July 4th day, it might make sense to take it in a little bit of a different direction. So what is Grunch? Grunch is an acronym, and Bucky explains it this way. There's no dictionary word for an army of invisible giants, 1,000 miles tall, with their arms interlinked, girding the planet Earth. Since there exists just such an invisible, abstract, legal contrivance army of giants, we have invented the word Grunch as the group designation, a Grunch of Giants. GRUNCH, which stands for Annual Gross Universe Cash Heist, pays annual dividends of over $1 trillion US. So that's what Grunch is. Grunch is kind of this system of control or regulation or structure, and we're going to explore more about it, and it's in this book, Grunch of Giants. How does Bucky define Grunch, or what does Grunch do? This is the second part. Grunch is engaged in the only by instruments reached and operated, entirely invisible chemical, metallurgical, electronic, and cybernetic realms of reality. So only by instruments reached and operated. The way to think about this visually is like the 400 to 700 nanometers that you can see, and then all of the other electromagnetic bands like Wi-Fi, radio, etc. So these realms, which are not part of our unaugmented sensory apparatus, but can be exploited because it's part of this universal, just like there's, it'd be like owning a color to own a wavelength. So maybe in that sense, there's like all this possibility and value, but these other bands that are outside of an individual person's perception, it's difficult for an individual person to get a control of. So almost as a tautological consequence of that, these channels become controlled by things that are larger than individual people. And it's pretty interesting how Bucky connects that idea of what you can perceive with or without instrumentation to a few different domains, including cybernetics. So this is from the 80s when he's writing it. Then, what's one interesting way, not the only way he goes into, that Grunch exerts control? By making pre-graduation employment contracts with almost all promising university science students, it monopolizes all the special theoretical know-how to exploit its vast inventory of already acquired invisible know-how technology. So that kind of knowledge technology is the extremely valuable information that allows exploitation of these bands of operating that are being dominated by the Grunch. And one way they do it is pre-graduation employment contracts. So it was just interesting for me to wonder about what those were. Was that the promise of employment? Does that reflect student debt? Does it inflect something else? So pretty interesting points about what Grunch is and does. Here's another interesting quote from the section 3, Heads or Tails We Win, Inc. Corporations are neither physical nor metaphysical phenomena. They are socio-economic ploys, legally enacted game playing, agreed upon only between overwhelmingly powerful socioeconomic individuals and by them imposed upon human society and all its unwitting members. How can little humans successfully cope with this greatest of all history's invisible Grunch of non-human giants? First of all, we humans must comprehend the giants' games and game-playing equipment, rules, and scoring systems. But before we can comprehend their game playing, we must study the history and the development of giants themselves. So with Bucky, it's always about the general and the specific, And it's almost like there's this game theory, which is invoked multiple times. The games of the giants, the need to understand how they play and how the rules are and the scoring systems. He's saying we need to understand the specifics of what exactly got us to this point, but also the general of the game theory and the structure of interactions, the shape of interactions that in general leads to certain kinds of outcomes. So we have general and specifics, with him wanting to know about both the history of the corporations and countries that are in place today, but also, again, those general trends. So it's kind of synergetic thinking with macro and micro applied to, I guess, geopolitics. Okay, so instead of just copying more paragraphs of Grunch out, let's look at a little bit of the history. So this is from his, I guess, his CV on the BFI Institute. And it was interesting to note that both Bucky and Grunch have a phase change in the late 1960s to early 1970s, which is, funnily enough, kind of the Grateful Dead sweet spot, at least for me. And here's a quote from Grunch, which I've put in the middle. This actual but invisible threshold crossing began in 1969 when human scientific knowledge and technological ingenuity, backed exclusively by adequate citizens' tax-raised government financing, learned how to do so much with so little as to be able to place humans on the moon and return them safely to Earth. So he's pointing at the moon experience in 1969 and leading up to it, slightly following it, as sort of this pinnacle of achievement of a mobilized military research industrial complex, this wartime level of defense and research starting to become integrated and created. And that's something we'll see more about in a few slides. But in this graph, we have time on the x-axis from the 20s to the 80s, and the y-axis is the total per year in the solid line, and then the cumulative in the dashed line of the published reference to Buckminster Fuller from 1917. And it's just interesting that right there, he gets a little blip in the late 1960s, and then he, right in 1969 and 70, starts taking off in terms of his mentions. So he's having this parallel experience, at least in visibility, but it's something, of course, he's been working on for decades before this all happened, because he started in the 20s. But there's this phase transition, and perhaps one for society too, that happened during that time. So here's what he writes in Grunch. I have been a deliberate, half-century fused inciter of a cool-headed, natural, gestation rate-paced revolution, armed with physically demonstrable living levers with which altogether to elevate all humanity to realization of an inherently sustainable, satisfactory to all, ever higher standard of living. And it being 2021 and whatnot, I was like, what happened 50 years ago? And of course, there's a website for that. And it's WTFhappenedin1971.com. And this is the first graph on the page, but there's a lot of graphs. And it's kind of just a meme because, of course, nothing happens with just 1 year. Even phase transitions are kind of messy in their own right. So, of course, it's just a meme. But there's some pretty striking graphs that reflect how certain things that were correlated or anti-correlated before 1971, between that year, plus or minus 3 years, there's some major changes to certain economic, social features. So here we are, 50 years after whatever happened in 1971. And maybe this is the 50th year celebration or something like that. Later in Grunch, he writes, critical threshold crossing of the inevitable revolution is already underway. The question is, can it be successfully accomplished before the only instinctively operating fear and ignorance preclude success by one individual, authorized or unauthorized, pushing the first button of chain reacting all buttons pushing atomic race irradiated suicide. So the phase transition has already been passed in his mind. And this is leading to this single point of failure. One individual, that's whether they're authorized or unauthorized, according to whom, in a time of pluralism, right? That first person who pushes the first button, that's going to lead to certain catastrophic events. And it's just as true now as it always was, because the complex threat surfaces are vast and the relationships are really complex as well. So it's really hard to know what that button is. Maybe it's a like button, maybe it's some power plant. So who knows what is what with the buttons and the complex networks. So to kind of pull back to a level where we might be able to model it theoretically or just visually, it's a lot like Waddington's epigenetic landscape metaphor, which I have up here on my wall as well. It's almost like Bucky saying that, around 1971, there was this bifurcation point. Maybe it was 50 years before then. And then here we are kind of at another phase transition point. So we're already going down whatever historical branch happened over the last 50 years, much of which I wasn't alive for. But we're at another branching point. Every year we're at a branching point. This one just shows a few, but we can think about it in these 50-year lag cycles, and we're at a branching point with our actions every single day. And just like you could line up cell fates on these valleys or different morphologies of ant, Bucky framed it as this decision between using our productivity and ability to provide. Are we going to use that for weaponry and killingry, or are we going to make livingry? We already had all these metal warping factories. We had the ability to make high throughput houses. We could have supported people domestically and abroad, but was that capacity relinquished, or was the hold on the weapons production strengthened? Did we move towards livingry? So this is kind of an epigenetic way that Bucky's framing it, epigenetic landscape, bifurcation point, complex threat surfaces way, saying that we can't go back to some previous branch. We might not even want to. So what are we going to do in the branching going forward? Not hypotheticals about branching in the past, because we're not going back there. So let's go into a few of the specifics that Bucky lays out. He writes this: what was once world-around high credit for American ingenuity and friendliness is no longer existent. On February 1st, 1982, the United States ambassador to the United Nations stated to the media that all the, quote, United Nations now hate the USA, end quote, from Bucky. What they hate is Grunch, but Grunch is able to deceive the world into blaming the very innocent people of the United States. So, I don't know about the veracity of that story about the ambassador, or whether that's felt one way in one part of the world or not. I've traveled some outside, but can't say that I've spoken to all the people or found out. So, of course, it's a complex issue what countries think about each other, but interesting for Bucky to say that basically there's the people of, just even beyond America, just the people of their country, and he's saying that there's a distinction between the people of a country and what the government does, because sometimes the Grunch moves without any individuals or most individuals' support. So what does Bucky point to as how we got to this point? It's a longer story than one paragraph, obviously, but just to kind of point out one way that he narrates it, he writes, as the Allies' purchasing agent from 1914 to 1918, Morgan's amassing in the U.S., J.P. Morgan, of the profits of World War I shifted the world capital of the Grunch of corporate giants from Europe to America, and until the 1929 crash, assured Morgan's dominance of the socio-economic evolutionary balance of power over human affairs on planet Earth. So you gotta go to Grunch and do your own side research for the full story from Bucky on history, from just proto-human history through activities during the 1900s up to what he perceived as the imminent future. But it's just interesting to note that he points out that after World War I and the asymmetric relationship of the United States, essentially during and after that war, it resulted in a transfer of the locus of power to the United States of America. I'm sure people have debated that with people coming down on both sides, but whatever the situation is or isn't, it's changing. So then in the second section, because many of the invisible supranational corporations' manufacturing facilities are presently located on USA geography, and the invisible giants' armaments objectives require 10 years lead time, the Colossus has now of necessity placed its initial armaments orders in the USA, situated factories. Capitalism's supranational corporate colossus also finds its most convenient and invisibly expedient to continue doing its business under the name United States, which is easy for it to do effectively. First, quite simply, by hoisting the American flag in front of all of its factories, and second, by pulling the vital strings of the finance-shackled and lobby-locked congressional puppets to make them pass the requisite legislation. Thus, the Colossus, now early 1982, has in production the necessary first things first of its ultimate 10-year, multi-trillion-dollar procurement, world published as being USA National Defense Activity. So how did we get here with the way that we spending the way we do? And rather than speculate, which I really don't try to do because I don't know what I don't know, I wanted to look in the records, the public records, which is a truly American and honorable tradition of searching for public records, and where there's a gray zone, pushing for transparency. So I looked in the congressional records for mentions of Bucky, and this is not all of the records. There's a few mentions, including a few court cases that were kind of interesting, but I'll just pull out a few and list them in three orders, because there was at least three epochs of Congress that heard about Bucky in one way or another. So here's in 1972, so it's kind of cool that this reference was right in that, Europe 72, Grateful Dead period. Here's, I guess, Honorable Tenno Roncalio from Wyoming on 5/9/72. And they wrote, as odd as much an echo of science fiction as this may sound, our continued existence as a power to be reckoned with, but moreover as a country strong and wealthy enough to support our people, may shortly depend on our discovering absolutely new and as yet untried sources of energy. This is not my suggestion alone, but also that of several renowned experts and inventors such as the famous R. Buckminster Fuller. In a recent speech before the students of the University of Colorado, Fuller suggested some of the ways in which this might be done. Not only must we devise new energy sources, but we must create ways in which the energy we do use might be used sparingly and might also be conserved. A student, Dennis D. Metesky, was so inspired by Mr. Fuller's speech that he wrote an extended account of it for the Denver Post of last Sunday. It is my pleasure to insert this account, as well as the imaginative suggestions from Mr. Fuller from which it contains, into the record at this time. So nice, just a side reference. But before I get to that reference, there was actually another reference to Bucky in that same issue. And so that one read as Development, It's Why We're Walking, by Joel Kimmons, Education Director of American Freedom from Hunger Foundation. And it was written, racism, while hardly addressed sufficiently as a worldwide issue, is at least acknowledged. Imperialism is unpopular. Even economic growth for its own sake is at last being questioned as a valid national objective. As Buckminster Fuller has said, if you can go to the moon and under the Arctic ice, you can make the world work. So how interesting that these issues are still so important to bring up today in 2021, and it just sets the frame for these kinds of access to the records and studying through history and the really important dialogues that have happened in the past to make sense of what Bucky's suggestions are for the current day. So what did Dennis write? These are just a few of the paragraphs because it's a bit longer than this, but it was written, Buckminster Fuller has dedicated his life to charting the world's resources and has found there's enough to go around. And if these resources are used efficiently, everyone in the world can be put on a higher standard of living than any of us know now. Nice. Still totally true. Second paragraph. A good example of doing more with less is copper wire. At first it could transmit one voice, then 4, then 16, until now it carries thousands. The transatlantic cable took tons and tons of copper. Now a single satellite does many, many more times more work using an infinitesimally small amount of copper, the rest being available for recycling. So pretty cool. It's like this supply and demand between the resources and our technologies, because our physicables, the things that we make, they will require physical hardware, directly and indirectly. So how do we do more with less with what we make so that we can have more to recycle and use for making things that we need or conserving where we don't? But we need to start and recenter with making what we have more efficient and doing more with less, because then we'll have more to recycle and figure out new things to do with, including providing for more people. It seems that our whole problem lies in our unwillingness to try something new or explore other alternatives. Instead of turning on the ship's seepage systems, we are hanging over the edge watching it sink. Maybe this is why Fuller wrote a book called Utopia or Oblivion, The Prospects for Humanity. So, just like in Grunch, there's that bifurcation metaphor. Is it going to be sink or swim? Which way, America? That kind of Bucky framing is pretty interesting. Okay, that was 72. Here's in the records in 1980. This is by Honorable Robert W. Edgar of Pennsylvania. I don't have to tell the people around and this is all just entered into the congressional record. I don't have to tell the people around Philadelphia who Buckminster Fuller is. In fact, no one on earth needs to be told who Bucky Fuller is. But you of all people know him, for he chose to make Philadelphia his center for operation. He is a universal, timeless citizen if there ever was one. Perhaps some of you were lucky enough to hear Bucky on Christmas Day. He was interviewed for an hour on public radio, and as usual his discourse was full of the charm of unexpected revelation. At one point he was asked how he defined environment, and he said, "Well, I was thinking about that back in 1928, and I wrote a little poem about it. It went like this. Environment, I think, must be all there is." Sorry, I'll restart. Environment, I think, must be all there is that is but me. The universe, I think, must be all there is but me and me. So that's a poem. A simple little rhyme, but like Bucky himself, deceptively simple. It's the realization of the peculiarly unique individual that you are, and its total connection to everything else in creation that endows environmental education with its wonder and urgency. That accounts for the hold it exerts over susceptible people, and the way it is carving its own course and widening its channels throughout our whole human scene. So nice Bucky poem getting entered into the congressional record. Pretty cool. And then also it reminded me of active inference and the free energy principle, where you have the agent in the niche. So that's like the TET, the blanket states, sense and action. And then the internal is the agent in the generative model. And then the niche is everything else. So once you've got those two, the generative process for the system of interest, what it encloses, the boundary, and then the outside, that's universe. So he's defining what there is to separate oneself off from the universe, but also respect the totality of it. And we'll come back to this idea in the end of this live stream. So that was in 1980, where Bucky got a poem into the congressional record. And then here's one of the last relevant ones I could find. This one was just a beauty. This is in, I guess, late March 1993. Mr. Grassley. Quote, "Mr. President, Buckminster Fuller once said the following: When I am working on a problem, I never think about beauty. I think only of how to solve the problem. But when I am finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it is wrong. Mr. President, the budget resolution we just passed is not beautiful. It is ugly. And therefore, according to Buckminster Fuller's evaluation, this budget is wrong. So I don't know what the budget was, so spare any political interpretation. It's just a beautiful example of the appeal to Bucky, argument by Bucky, argument by aesthetics. Don't know how well this worked out for Mr. Grassley in this situation, or whether it worked out for the country or not, or whether we could have maybe even passed something that was better than the one that was being discussed by Grassley. Who knows? But great use of the Bucky quote. So to close the Grunch section, how do we scrunch the Grunch? So how do we move through this phase? The only happily promising recourse of each human individual is to our highest intellectual faculties and their mutual, ego-deflated, unselfishly loving preoccupation with comprehensivity and our employment of the most powerful tools of all. So we have a preference, and we need to comprehensively employ the following tools, A through G. A, the family of generalized scientific principles governing the operational design of eternally regenerative universe itself. So that's something there's been a lot of interesting discussion on in the TrimTab group about what are these generalized principles? Are they first principles of our own experience, but how are those perhaps influenced by our culture or our development, which experiences we've had access to? So are those the principles, or how would we know that we found them, or that one is generalized enough? Just a lot of related questions. B, comprehending and effectively employing synergetics with the books Synergetics and Synergetics 2, presenting the comprehensive, omni-imageable mathematical coordinate system employed by nature, thus avoiding the mentally debilitating vast majority of humanity excluding quasi-mathematical coordinate system employed by present-day science. So, Bucky going hard on the XYZ Cartesian coordinate system, saying it's quasi-mathematical and debilitating, and remains to be seen. Sometimes Synergetics is aspirational in terms of what it believes people could unlock if they really thought of this way of geometry. Maybe it'd be easier to learn as a child or something like that, so it'd be cool to see that kind of synergetic education. Just test this hypothesis. B, let's educate people this way. C, comprehending the major objectives and operating strategies of the major opposing power structures of world politics, their present status quo, and probable future trending. So in B, he's saying one route is we can learn synergetics both early in life, but also just at any stage. And hopefully there's many accessible ways to get into synergetics and tensegrity. I think that's one of the coolest things, is when it's like the ground floor of synergetics is the coolest. It's all about the TET. It's just about learning more about how the TET works. So I think that's what also helps it be not something that has to be just learned from birth or at a super esoteric level. But to connect those generalized ways of thinking about education in B to C, it's like you also have to figure out what is the operations that are ongoing. What are the goals, the objectives, and the ways in which different power structures are compressing and in tension with each other. We can just do a tensegrity model and not judge right or wrong, but understand how to act in the system. D, comprehending the fundamentals of economics, of wealth versus money, of the principal features and functioning of industry, banking, and securities. So D is related to C here. So it's not just about the geopolitics, it's about the tokenomics, the economics, the game theory about wealth, money, value, functioning of financial systems, which of course are changing. They were changing in the 1970s when I believe the gold standard was like finally disconnected from money in 1972. And then here we are coming up on 2022, where maybe there'll be some type of crypto regulation or some new type of financial regulation. It could happen. I don't speculate about specific laws, but it's just about these 50-year cycles. And again, 1971, what happened? 1972, what happened? How is that going to influence our currency 50 years after? And how does that timescale, just even though we know it's going to be a continuum of influence, how does that help us focus and look back through deep time and plan through deep time? E. Comprehending the educational system in general, as well as the discovery of the shortcomings of science, engineering, and education in general. So this is really tying it back to E for education. F. Synergetically comprehending what it is all about, as propounded in Critical Path and this book, Grunch of Giants, and discovering what our options are to confront imminent race disaster. So that's the critical path framing. It's critical as in it's really important. It's critical like phase change. And then it's critical like we have to be interrogating it. There's all these different ways to think about critical path. G. The individual discovery of God by a vast majority of human individuals. Not the discovery of religions, but the discovery that each and every individual has an always instantly open, no intermediary switchboard authority to contend with, no interference of any kind, direct hotline to God, i.e. the weightless, non-physical communication occurring teleologically between the differentially limited, weightless, non-physical, temporal, special case mind of the individual human and the comprehensively integrated macro-micro, unlimited, weightless, eternal, generalized mind of God. So that's the ultimate technology, armor of God, and belief and faith, which he differentiates as well in his work. And that's what helps us scrunch the grunch, among other things. One of those technologies that Bucky brings up in Grunch is, and also in this upcoming Playboy interview, is the world game. So just thought it was cool. Here's a PNAS paper from 2018 called Forecasting Innovations in Science, Technology, and Education. And it's written, computational models are particularly useful if they are combined with high-quality data and if they are widely used and understood. As early as 1960, Buckminster Fuller proposed the world game to address the world's problem through a holistic and anticipatory systems approach. The game used Fuller's Dymaxion map to visualize resources, trends, and scenarios. It was meant to be accessible to everyone, not just experts. Therefore, decisions could be made collectively, and the results could be used by anyone. That's pretty cool. It, of course, is reminiscent of some of the experiments in governance and analytical dashboards and collective decision-making experiments, collective intelligence. It's totally happening now, and Bucky was 50 to 60 years ahead of his time. 61 years ahead of his time. The world game that Fuller envisioned was to be a place where individuals or teams of people came and competed or cooperated to, quote, make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of everyone. So this is like serious games. It's like war gaming, like with a red team and the blue team, and the kinds of strategy that you can train up and foster in that kind of a game setting. It's about analytics and dashboards. It's about distributed collaboration. It's just so interesting what Bucky was thinking about and the ways that he was implementing what he was learning, like the ability to make, for example, a map projection that didn't, at least geographically, distort the size of land. That's the Dymaxion. Plus, it conveys the tetrahedral worldview because of, there's a lot of reasons, but ranging from the spherical modeling to some of the other advantages that you get from having the world in this kind of a shape breakdown, to design as anticipatory design science. So cybernetics and the ability to plan, we're designing interventions, we're steering that ship. So we're making decisions now that bifurcate us one way or the other. All of this comes together in world game, and I've never participated in a world game, but if there's someone happening, I think that'd be pretty cool. have like a world game culture. And then here was just a few graphics and visuals that I found while researching World Game today. So this is not sure what year it's from, but it's the World Game that was held at the University of Pennsylvania. And just nice big font play, the World Game. Hyphenate, but you can hyphenate when there's 3 lines to 4, but other than that, could get a little messy. But well done with a shape of a tet. And then down there on the bottom right was a graphic I had never seen with this 4. So a nice, again, usage of the 4 with 4 pieces: art, design, archive, conversations. So that's pretty cool. I think that's a nice model for some of the things that we're seeing happening right now with communities of practice online. But again, more generally, serious games, wargaming, all these issues, collaboration games, innovation communities, all these things could use these 4 dimensions. And then this was from this tetworld.tripod.com site, a kind of psychedelic graphic where there's maybe like an IMAX. I don't know if you're inside of it or outside of it, but it's like this tet shape, truncated tet with the Dymaxion map. And then there's schoolrooms around it. So maybe sometimes you're at the control deck, you're playing the world game. Other times you're in the classroom studying or learning or interacting, doing something different. So you're not always at the world game terminal, because it feels like when we're always plugged into the world game, we don't have the time away from the game, but the game is just meant to be dipped into in this setting. And then there was a few nice tet, as you might predict from a site called Tet World, but that was a nice tet site. All right, now on to the last piece with the Playboy interview. Okay, so sorry for sensitive eyes. This is the cover of Playboy in February 1972, and then on the right side is the Playboy interview with R. Buckminster Fuller that describes him as an American architect, systems theorist, author, designer, inventor, and futurist. And then I think this is a screenshot of the picture of the printing of the Playboy, where it looks like that same title picture triptych of Bucky is opposite Why I Smoke Vantage. So a cigarette ad. Okay, so top left. Playboy. Is there a single statement you could make that would express the spirit of your philosophy? Fuller says, I always try to point one thing out. If we do more with less, all our resources are adequate to take care of everybody. All political systems are founded on the premise that the opposite is true. We've been assuming all along that failure was certain, that our universe was running down, and it was strictly you or me, kill or be killed as long as it lasted. But now in 1 century, we've discovered that man can be a success on his planet, and this is the great change that has come over our thinking. So he's contrasting zero-sum economics with that sort of Malthusian / one interpretation of Darwinian of selection happening with limitation. And he's saying, well, we figured out through industrialization via generalized principles that we're pretty much able to actually provide for just the number of people on this planet. It's not like we have to provide for infinite people. We have to provide for however many billion. So that's something that we can tackle if we actually want to. It's not something that is just some asymptote that will never be achieved. It's not like it's a 1/x function. It's like, how are we going to take care of people? Playboy. And you're saying that man is on the point of discovering that role. Fuller. I think he's just discovering himself in his full significance. The child in the womb is completely innocent and completely looked out for. Then he comes out and has to do his own breathing. Then he gets to his feet and has to do a little more. He takes on a little more responsibility and gains in self-discovery. Well, man is just now coming out of the womb of what I call permitted ignorance. The average man is beginning to realize why he is here in the universe. That is exactly what young people are continually asking. When I talk to them, being a comprehensivist instead of a specialist, I find that they speculate and discover they probably do have the function that I'm talking about. which is comprehensivity. And suddenly, they change completely. I find that we're in a moment of fantastic self-discovery and are approaching an entirely new relationship with our universe. So pretty interesting describing that Europe 72 phase transition in self-discovery. What is the year 50 years after influenced by because of what happened in what he's describing, and how is what we're doing influencing 50 years out? Here, I'm not going to read Fuller's answer, but it's asked by Playboy, how does it make you feel to know that your own work has been used for military purposes? Does it disturb you to realize that Russia is encircled by geodesic domes housing American radar installations? So read the interview for Bucky's answer, or look at it here. Playboy, you often speak of how impressed you were with America's production capacity during World War I. Were you inspired by the military then? Fuller, I was part of a world that was highly biased, that knew very little of, quote, the enemy. Propaganda effects on the young men were very high. It seemed to be a question of bad people trying to destroy good people. I went into the Navy, and I learned a great deal from the equipment that was being used. The boats we used could have served constructive purposes, as indeed many did once the war was over. And then there's more history provided, but that's just really interesting how Bucky thought about the military in his time. Here's a few really interesting quotes. So on the top left, we've always played musical chairs in our society. We start with 100 people and 99 chairs, and we keep eliminating chairs. The kind of change I'm talking about is when you begin with one chair and end up with 100. Every time the music stops, more people are sitting down. When there was only one chair, you might have felt pretty damn exclusive when you sat down. But now we know that, for the first time in history, the chair manufacturer can make enough for everyone. It's going to be a different game. Playboy, it won't be much fun for the people who were used to winning. Fuller, that's true, of course. I used to say that the world game I was proposing had no opposition. I was incredibly wrong, because you have to play against a formidable number of things. Once I worked it out like a football team, I had 11 important players, such as fear, unfamiliarity, inertia. Ignorance was quarterback. What about greed, Playboy? Fuller, he played center. So that's how Bucky was thinking about the games, the serious games, war games that he was playing. Then on this bottom quote, that brought me to a severe analysis of industrial society, and I saw that if I could go 50 years ahead, everybody would leave me alone. And that's exactly the way it happened. I was allowed to do anything I wanted, and people said, well, you're very amusing, but obviously I can't take you seriously. But because I deliberately got to living and thinking 50 years ahead on a comprehensive basis, I inadvertently got myself into a strange position. I began to live on that frontier, and it was like any wave phenomena. I was living where it was cresting, and things happened to me long before they happened to the rest of society. So that's related to Bucky being described as a futurist sometimes. But again, here we are 50 years after that interview that is happening, and we're just resonating with what Bucky thought, past, present, future, adding our own perspective, contributing to the geometry and the beauty of all the perspectives on what Synergetics is. Playboy, a moment ago you mentioned the world game. Fuller, here's his direct answer, which is pretty how he navigates towards it. The only way we can get somewhere is by having a completely different way of seeing our world, an informational approach. I saw that back in 1927, I could see the big changes coming. I could schedule many of them, plot them out by means of various curves showing invention lags, showing the fallout from the new production. I began to play the game of looking at the total Earth as I was taught in the Navy. The Navy was absorbed in this kind of thinking, surveying the Earth in source of resources and advantage. So I asked, what is the value of a war game? And clearly the answer was that you pay no attention to sovereign boundaries. You transcend them. And I said I'd like to have the same transcendental advantage of looking at the world and its resources, but I'd like to see how to use those resources to do more with less. And that's what brought me over to the idea of a world game. So that's how he cybernetically navigates from needing a shift in perspective through his experience in the Navy and what he learned from some of their best practices as a high reliability organization, down to that's what brought him to the idea of a world game, which we'll return to. I guess that was why we had it at the part before the interview, but we talked a little bit about it. We can return to what it might look like in the future too. So again, they're talking in 1972. And then Playboy asks, isn't 1985 a very short timetable for the kind of fundamental historical change you foresee? And Fuller writes, 1975 is still a long way off, let alone 1985. When you get to 1975, you'll hardly be able to remember sitting here in 1971. It will seem so far back. It's a very strange thing, as things happen and changes occur, how quickly society says, of course that's obvious, and, oh well, that's the way it always was. If you say to somebody, I prognosticated that, they'll tell you that everybody knew it. That's very, very common. But the fact is that man is continually being surprised. He doesn't dream of the changes that come in his lifetime, but the minute they occur, he develops a marvelous ability to take them for granted. So, let's transpose these numbers into the 2020s. 2025 is still a long way off, let alone 2035. When you get to 2025, you'll hardly be able to remember sitting here in 2021. It's classic stuff, and how quickly society changes, or that's the way it always was. We've seen different regions change their behavior and norms in the US and globally so much in the last few years. And there's things that are like, duh, today, and there's things that we're still learning the hard way and the easy way and just the tragic way. So this is so applicable. And then this part about humans being continually surprised, that's tying also back to kind of cybernetics and active inference and reducing your surprise about what individuals are going through and what society is going through. But he's saying things are happening so fast because we're in this exponential phase of whatever this killingly, livingry, epigenetic bifurcation landscape, whatever the force is that's driving that forward, that's either going to be utopia or oblivion, the name of his book, then whatever's driving that, the bifurcation landscape and the imperative, that is already left the station. Then this one on the bottom right, Fuller. Something hit me very hard once, thinking about one little person could do. Think of the Queen Elizabeth again. The whole ship goes by, and then comes the rudder. And there's a tiny thing on the edge of the rudder called a trim tab. It's a miniature rudder. Just moving that little trim tab builds a low pressure that pulls the rudder around. It almost takes no effort at all. So I said that the individual can be a trim tab. Society thinks it's going right by you, that it's left you altogether. But if you're doing dynamic things mentally, the fact is that you can just put your foot out there like that, and the whole ship of state is going to turn around. So I said, call me trim tab. Classic story retold many times by Bucky, written on his gravestone, his epitaph, call me trim tab. Really important idea. Little bit reincarnated through the Trim Tab book club, and it's just an archetype that everybody can think about and wonder about how they're trim tabbing. It's like the butterfly effect, but the butterfly effect is often raised to mean just that there's unpredictable consequences in the future, and that things that are super, super rare, like again, a hurricane happening or not because of just one thing, as if you could isolate the causal impact of just one part of a complex system. So it's a little bit of a disinfo framing instead of focusing on like the mode or the most likely outcome, the most likely diffusion. So the rudder and the trim tab brings it back to agency and our capacity to choose and to act. which is completely different than the, oh, it's random, it's the butterfly effect, we'll never know, which is reified in all the time travel movies. And then another, at least left-right piece on the rudder is the rudder is constrained to left and right. And then there's other features that make the ship go in different directions. And, a ship can only go to the left or to the right. Maybe a spaceship can go in more dimensions. And then if the rudder tilts to the left, then the ship is going to go to the left. And then if the, rudder goes to the right, then the ship is going to go to the right. And it's interesting to think about, what is the trim tab doing relative to the ship? What is the rudder doing relative to the ship? And then closing out this Playboy section, there was Buckminster Fuller's Self-Disciplines, which is apparently from chapter 4 in Critical Path, but they're just nice. So we'll look through them because it's kind of like, what can we do, for our country? What can our country do for us? What can we do for each other? All those important questions on July 4th. And here were the self-disciplines that Bucky wrote. So 1, and I don't want to always, I just want to read him directly, but oftentimes it doesn't have to be about just the fact that he's a male or that, like in the previous paragraphs. So 1, use myself as an experiment to see what, if anything, a healthy young male human of average size, experience, and capability with an economically dependent wife and newborn child, starting without capital or any kind of wealth, cash savings, credit, or university degree, could effectively do that could not be done by great nations or great private enterprise to lastingly improve the physical protection and support of all human lives. So he's saying, what affordances and possibilities do I have as just a regular person? How can I out-scrunch the grunch? 2, commit all of my productivity towards dealing only with the whole planet Earth and all its resources and cumulative know-how. Observation of my life to date shows that the larger the number for whom I work, the more positively effective I become. Thus, it is obvious that if I work always and only for all humanity, I will be optimally effective. Pretty nice, inspirational quote by Bucky. Like, the higher our goal, the bigger the delta is, the more tension cybernetically there is, maybe the faster we achieve it, or the more effective we can be. It's like a jet ski with a faster boat or something like that. 3, seek to do my own thinking, confining it to only experientially gained information. So kind of a short Buckyism about a commitment to respecting his own perspective and also other people's perspective, and not judging beyond the experience that he gets, which includes information from other people. 4, seek to accomplish whatever is to be attained in such a manner that the advantage attained would never be secured at the cost of another or others. So it's kind of like saying, whatever path you decide, you can't result in a net loss for someone else. So just because you can make some money building some pipeline or environmental modification, if that ends up having a negative effect on other people, your project is not cool. It's not good to go on that project. You're doing something wrong. So how do we determine negative effects, or what happens if everything has a negative effect for somebody? That's the question of working together. 5, seek to cope with all humanly unfavorable conditions by searching for the family of relevant physical principles involved. Focus on the conditions for humanity. We're living in the niche, so let's focus on the niche. The niche is physical and informational, just like nature is. It is nature. It's the rest of the universe except for us. So let's figure out the general physical principles like thermodynamics. How are we going to support people who are in cold climates or warm climates? We want to think about thermodynamics in order to build best for all these people. 6, reduce my inventions to physically workable models and must never talk about the inventions until physically proved or disproved. So this is kind of like a self-discipline, really more for him than for most people, saying that he's committed to making physical objects that model his ideas with his inventions. And then also, this is a little bit more of a general principle, to not talk about the inventions until they're proved or disproved physically. So he didn't release drafts until he had versions that he thought were really demonstrable of some general principle that he wanted to convey. So that's kind of a cool design philosophy, and about not announcing something or before it's completed. 7, seek to reform the environment, not the humans. I am determined never to try to persuade humanity to alter its customs and viewpoints. So he's a niche modifier, saying that it's better to just have people follow the pheromone trail and the information and the incentives as the environment lays, rather than to coerce or persuade. 8, never promote or sell either my ideas or artifacts or pay others to do so. All support must be spontaneously engendered by evolution's integrating of my inventions with the total evolution of human affairs. Kind of like an open source mentality. 9, assume that nature has its own gestation rates, not only for the birth of each new biological component, but also for each inanimate technological artifact. So there's this lag gestation idea, kind of a development of technology, developmental technology, which we're seeing with these evolutionary tech and brain-computer interfaces, and the way in which technology has this lag period. The cell phone, or whatever we want to call it, is invented, and then it becomes adopted at this level, and then this level, and have we seen all the implications of cell phones being adopted around the world? No, we haven't. So that's still in the gestating phase. 10, seek to develop my artifacts with ample anticipatory time margins so that they will be ready for use by society when society discovers, through evolutionary emergencies, a need for them. So a few things in there. First is a principle for himself, with designing for where you'll need to be rather than designing super narrowly for where we are. So that's a really cool way to think about that navigational and anticipatory and sense-making or wayfinding approach to design in Synergetics and tensegrity. It's like where we'll need the solution, we want to intersect with it. Let's not solve the current moment. So let's understand the current state of the world and where things are heading, and then we have this vectorial way to look at where the causes are going to clash or where a risk surface might open. Like if it looks like we're evenly protected on a border that needs even protection, and right in the snapshot, it's all good, but you know the direction that each guard is heading, you can see where a gap might open. So how could we take that sort of military way of doing anticipatory behavioral allocation and design, and then think about supporting everyone? Well, are we discovering now that it's emergence through emergency, that we have a need for this kind of efficiency? 11, seek to learn the most from my mistakes. So nice and short. Okay, then here's the last non-closing slide, and then the second half of his self-practices. So 12, seek to decrease time wasted in worried procrastination and to increase time invested in discovery of technological effectiveness. So this is kind of like early like work / life hacking / deep work. I don't know, saying don't worry, don't procrastinate, spend more time making more efficient ways of working. So something everyone's probably working and struggling with, but he had as a principle, and he was already dealing with that kind of cognitive overload and just total signal fragmentation and prediction fatigue and uncertainty, all these kinds of things that threaten cognitive security today. Bucky was experiencing them earlier because he was having like a different informational input, obviously had a different way of thinking about things. 13, seek to document my development in the official records of humanity by applying for and being granted government patents. It's kind of something Bucky did, and a lot of post-Buckyites did is this patent game, which I've never done a patent, so I just don't know too much about it. But of course, I've seen some cool patents. Don't know much about it though. 14. Above all, seek to comprehend the principles of eternally regenerative universe and discover how humans function in these principles. Also, kind of classic Bucky, just general and specific. You got to understand how the Grunch came to be specifically and the general principles, because the current snapshot of the Grunch is not how it's going to change. So we can't just solve it in the current moment. We have to be thinking about our critical path to out-scrunch through time and space. 16. Is 15 missing? I don't know if I didn't crop it correctly or it's missing. 16. Seek to comprehend the full gamut of production tool capabilities, energy resources, and all relevant geological, meteorological, demographic, and economic data. So early big data Bucky saying you just need to comprehend, if not directly have the data sets and modeling for all these data analyses so that your world game can be the best simulation, digital twin, serious game, war game. You need all these kinds of info. Slow timescales, short timescales, geophysical data, human data, social, demographic data. 17. Seek to operate only on a do-it-yourself basis and only on the basis of intuition. So it's kind of going into the DIY, open source, OSINT area, saying do it yourself, figure it out yourself, but also look at the generalized principles and learn from other people. 18. Plan for my design science strategies to advantage the new life to be born on Earth. Life born unencumbered with the conditioned reflexes so prevalent today. So he's saying design for the future people who haven't yet been born. That's sort of the two sets of people, right? Those who have been born, those who haven't been born. So let's design for both of them. 19. Commit wholeheartedly to the above and pay no attention to, quote, earning a living in humanity's established economic system. Yet find that my families and my needs are provided for by seemingly pure happenstance and always only in the nick of time. This is one of Bucky's commitments to, quote, not earning a living, but it's pretty cool and interesting story how, of course, he did earn a living. 20. I sought to operate only on a do-it-yourself basis and only on the basis of intuition. 17 and 20 look like basically the same. Not sure if that was on purpose. 21. I oriented what I called my comprehensive anticipatory design science strategies towards primarily advantaging the new life to be born within the environment controlling devices I was designing and developing, because the new lives would be unencumbered by conditional reflexes that might otherwise blind them to the potential advantages newly existent within the new environment control systems in which they found themselves beginning life. So that's also super similar to 18. I'm not sure quite about this list, but it's just unpacking what it means to have design be anticipatory and to also like influence education early, but education is for everybody. So I think the mind can be plastic enough to change within a lifetime. Maybe there's another level of plasticity between lifetimes. So that's why he wants to focus on Synergetics education for everybody, which is a cool notion. Then, just since it's the 4th of July, and if anyone's watching live, they can write something in the live chat, but I was just going to close on this slide with a drawing. I don't know when I made it, probably in 2020, of some of the Bayesian graphical network type models that we use in active inference, having that superimposed as the generative model and the policy selection model of a brain. So sort of embodying this brain mind model process duality that's so mystifying about the brain, and having that a higher frequency American flag. So inside and out, the agent and the niche, there's this concordance, but also the stripes are kind of like harmonizing with each other, but they don't overlap. So maybe even there's times where the generative model is discordant with the niche more times than not. What does that look like when it disagrees more often than not? And then there's just a few questions that it's not always about politics. It's not always about hot takes. So I don't just intend any of these things to be just questions of today or referencing any specific view on these questions, just trying to be neutral or prompting questions that are like synergetics and active inference ways that we can actually think ahead 50 years, because sometimes the short horizon and the extreme context leads to just unhelpful decisions being made. So kind of an active inference type question is, what do we expect our generative model of the United States of America to be like in 2071? And so that's looking ahead 50 years from now. Just like today, we went through like a few things that were in that 1971 to 1972 period, which was kind of funny how they all actually lined up on that like 1 or 2 years. Well, we're kind of in that exact 1 or 2 years. Second half of 2021, who knows what's going to happen in 2022, of course. So what are we expecting our model to be, which does also entail a generative model of the niche. So what do we expect? Because what we think is what we act as if that will be likely towards, or if there's high uncertainty, maybe there's other failure modes of cognition, like just paralysis. So what do we expect? How sure are we about that? All these are important questions for individuals, relationships, teams, states to figure out. What are our preferences over sensory outcomes? So it's not on this diagram of the generative model, but in active inference, it's not reinforcement learning. So it's not that everything gets boiled down to value or utility, which is often the case in reinforcement learning. It's kind of like a GDP way of looking at the country. Like it's about economic variables, or it's about reward, one scalar number that captures the reward, and that's what we're trying to optimize. And when we're getting good feedback from rewards, and we're learning well. So in contrast, active inference has like one part that's pragmatic about pursuing goals effectively, and then one part that's epistemic about learning what needs to be discovered. And so minimizing the free energy entails jointly minimizing those two, which is why active inference kind of rethinks that explore, exploit, or maybe even conserve versus progress or change dialectic. But where active inference breaks the symmetry and actually chooses policies is with preferences. So we have to have preferences over our sensory outcomes as individuals, multi-scale active inference agents. So what are our preferences? What do we actually prefer at this point in the multi-level system of governance that we're in? Then the third one, what are our individual and collective affordances, and how do they map onto hidden world states? So in active inference, again, not really directly shown in this graphic, is the way that policy is selected is by conditioning that estimate about outcomes on policies. So policies are selected from a set of affordances. Affordances are like possibilities. It's not just an economic affordance, it's like an ecological affordance, which is a little bit of a different body of literature, but again, it reflects that move from what's the economic affordance, what can the state spend or go into debt or whatever, versus what can we afford like socially in terms of our social capital. That shouldn't just be seen as a secondary kind of capital to Das Kapital. It should be like our affordances structure the choices that we're willing to make. And then also in active inference, one's choices, one's affordances, the policies that they end up choosing and enacting through actions, those don't directly influence world states. They actually influence the B matrix, which is the way that the hidden world states change through time. So we can't just act at one time step and have it change that time step. It has to change the outcomes that we prefer have to be realized over time because of the way that we changed how those states change through time. So that again brings us back to like, what time scale should we expect change to be on? But we can't just make random actions. We have to structure our policy decision making based upon how we're going to be influencing these hidden states in the future. So we need a generative model, which is why we have to learn about the Grunch in specific and in general. 4. How will we act, which is to update our action states, and infer, which is to update our internal states as to reduce uncertainty. That's kind of like the imperative of active inference, but those are what we can do. We can sense whatever we're sensing, and then act and infer, which includes a model of ourself and our niche, so that we're reducing uncertainty in the future. And that means sometimes acting to learn things or to reduce our rate of learning. And then the last one, how will we design and enact a policy for success or for satisfaction? Because this is what ties together inaction, enactive psychology and embodied psychology with design science and art, and then policy selection for individuals and for collectives. So just things to think about on July 4th. I'll just go back to the beginning if anyone has any final comments from the live chat, but thanks for watching. This was fun to do on the 4th. Just happy and respectful day for everybody, and talk to you another time. Bye.